I'm Charlie Redding.
And I'm Claire Fudge.
And this is the TRIBEathlon podcast.
They've sort of radioed ahead to say, some of the athletes have been fired at during the stage. And we arrived to the finish like half an hour before I think Heinrich Hausler had won. And then there was this massive media storm.
That was Julian Dean. And this episode is Future Marginal Gains. Julian Dean is a former professional road racing cyclist from New Zealand who competed as a professional between 1999 and 2013. He last rode for the UCI World Tour team Orica GreenEDGE, where he now works as a sporting director, and formerly he'd ridden with Lance Armstrong. His main achievements include racing in and completing 7 Tour de France's, 4 times Olympian, and he also won the 2007 and 2008 New Zealand National Road Race Championships. At the peak of his career, he was considered the best lead-out rider in the world. So Claire and I wanted to chat to him about the mental discipline of repeatedly setting up others for the win and not taking the glory yourself. We wanted to chat to him about racing in the Olympics versus the Grand Tours, about being shot whilst in the Tour de France, and also about where the future marginal gains are going to come from in cycling. So I know you're really going to enjoy this interview with Julian Dean. 33 Fuel produce award-winning natural sports nutrition, and everything they do is led by their philosophy for performance, for health, and for a fitter future. 33 Fuel's awesome products have been fueling triathletes since 2012, as well as many of the world's best athletes from other sports, like the England football team, Tour de France winners, and triathlon world champs, including 4 times Ironman world champ Chrissie Wellington, who's been using 33 Fuel for years. I personally love their products. I particularly love their protein shake. I think it's delicious, but it's also not full of a load of junk. I love their meal replacement, which is kind of brilliant for pre or post-workout recovery. I love their chia gels. Actually, they work really well for me. But especially I love their energy bars and their protein bars. They feel like a proper treat to eat, as well as being packed full of real amazing goodness. So find out more about 33fuel.com, and if you use the code TRIBEathlon or click the link in the show notes, you'll get a very extra special discount on your order. So Julian, welcome to the TRIBEathlon podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. We've got Claire here as well to kind of dive into the world of professional cycling, something that actually we both confess that we don't know that much about, despite the fact we spend a lot of time on a bike. So let's kick things off by, Julian, tell us a bit about how did you become a professional cyclist? Because I think there's a triathlon history there, isn't there? But how did you become a professional cyclist?
It's definitely quite interesting. If you go back in triathlon history, New Zealand's always had a very strong track record in triathlon. And if you go back to the 80s, of the eras of Aaron Baker and Rick Wells, triathlon was really an emerging sport in our country. And I really started doing, my interest in cycling grew out of triathlons. Aaron Baker and Rick Wells were real iconic athletes in New Zealand in the late 80s and early 90s. And there was a very sort of strong movement in triathlon led by them that sort of filtered right down into secondary schools. And I grew up in the North Island of New Zealand on the coast, and we had a lot of surf clubs and surf competitions and things like that, and the triathlon sort of grew out of that, and secondary school competitions. There were local triathlons up and down the Bay of Plenty coast sort of every weekend, and really it was just from a teacher at school getting a group of kids together that were interested. and started doing those. And so my first introduction to cycling was actually through triathlons, and led by icons like Aaron Baker and Rick Wells. And I sort of found, although I was reasonably good at triathlons and New Zealand Secondary School Championships, did well. It was sort of the thing for me, I guess, was the allure of cycling. Cycling was sort of always been a bit of a lower level sport in New Zealand. But I really liked the mystique of it, the European traditions of it, and started to pursue that a bit more by the time I got out of secondary school and started at university.
Fantastic. And so how did that transition through to becoming a professional cyclist? Funnily, we've just interviewed Leon Chevalier, who is a young professional triathlete, just came 7th in Kona. But his desire really is to be a professional cyclist. He would drop triathlon in a second if he could be a professional cyclist. So how did you make that transition? Where did that come from?
I think back in those days, I was still doing triathlons, and I made the New Zealand cycling team to go participate. I was sort of doing cycle races to try and improve my triathlon cycling. But I think what I really liked more was the cohesiveness and the tactics and the bunch riding, and it sort of turned out that I was developed for quite a young age. I was quite an explosive rider. I developed a really good sprint, so I was able to win bunch sprints and be as good as, if not better than, many of the sort of 17 or 18-year-olds in the sprints on the road. And I sort of just grew into that. I think it was more that sort of thrill of like the bunch sprinting and the touching and the danger element of it that as a teenage boy, that really sort of drew me into it, because I sort of probably had that sort of daredevil streak in me from when I was a young kid. Because when I was real younger, my first introduction to riding or racing a bike was through BMX, when I was sort of around 8 till 12.
And so I mean, I don't know if, I'm guessing you've seen A Sunday in Hell, the documentary about actually I've forgotten it's about Eddie Merckx not winning one of the Belgian classics. I can't actually even remember which one it is, but is it, that mystique around that type of racing, is that sort of what drew you in? Is that kind of, was it the romance of that type of stuff?
Yeah, I think so. These are some the reasons why we do sport on any level is a really interesting topic of conversation, and there's often some discussion now that certainly as a teenage boy, especially the competition aspect is really good, competing against others, but I think the motivations for being involved and the drivers over the years have sort of always been slightly different. And as I developed, particularly in cycling, which wasn't really, in the early 90s to mid 90s, there wasn't a real good pathway for triathlon. The sport was still sort of evolving. There were definitely international competitions, but globally it wasn't as prevalent as what cycling was, and particularly road cycling. And I have always had a bit of a, as many people from New Zealand do, a bit of a yearning to go overseas and to travel and to experience new cultures and things like that. And there was certainly a point where I got into my sort of late teens, early 20s, where cycling became a real cool vehicle, to go, and I got to go to the States and found a team in the States, was able to travel around the States and, just stay with random people and do races all over America, and got the chance to go to Europe and experience some different cultures in Europe. And that was really a big motivator for me. I mean, that's kind of, experiencing those different communities and social environments was definitely a big driver. I think we've got, and I may be wrong, but I think, you can do all that stuff with triathlon these days. But I think back then, there certainly wasn't the scene in triathlon globally that was available in road cycling to be able to get engaged in those experiences and experience different cultures, live in different countries and those sorts of things. And that's certainly what was a driver. I mean, I even remember when I first was with the US Postal Service, and after racing 3 years in the States, they wanted me to go to Europe and race in Europe. I still wasn't really, I wasn't like, oh yeah, I want to go to Europe and ride the Tour de France. I was like, oh yeah, that'd be cool. I'll go to Europe. US Postal Service was based in Spain. They had an apartment there for me, learn some Spanish, experience some other cultures, see a bit of Europe. And that's kind of what it was, as much as the racing. Not saying the racing wasn't important to me, but that side of it was, equally as attractive to me through a lot of my career as well.
So in another life, if you hadn't been as good a cyclist, you'd have probably ended up working. You might have ended up working in like walkabout, kind of roaming around the roaming around different parts of Europe. But as many of your compatriots do. And I think having travelled around New Zealand, I kind of understand the Kiwi culture of traveling, and it's I can get that. And one of the things I heard you say on a podcast, so I think your main entry into the kind of professional, well, not professional cycling world, but the kind of serious cycling world was the Commonwealth Games. And I remember hearing you say that actually you weren't that keen on the Commonwealth Games. You only did the Commonwealth Games once because, for example, they had to recruit South Africa, didn't they? So that there became 5 teams in there, and that became their bronze medal. But then I think I'm right in saying you've been involved with New Zealand coming back to do the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham more recently. What's your thoughts on the Commonwealth Games now? So tell us a bit about what your thoughts were then, and has that changed?
Yeah, so as an athlete, I only did one Commonwealth Games on the track in '94 in Victoria, Canada, and I was a bit underwhelmed when I went there, particularly for that reason. I mean, one of the great inspirations for me was, when I was 15 and my mum and dad took me to the Auckland Commonwealth Games, and I was able to go watch, the road race and the track cycling at the Auckland Commonwealth Games. New Zealand team did really well, and I thought that was amazing. And I was sort of still doing triathlons at that time, but I thought that was pretty cool. And then things progressed pretty quickly, and I found myself in '94 at the next Commonwealth Games on the track in the team's pursuit. Story, as you said, I think there was 4 teams. I needed a 5th team to be able to give a bronze medal, and I just felt that was always, and we ended up getting 3rd, getting the bronze medal, only because they scratched the South African team together. And I just felt it was a bit hollow and a bit underwhelming, because obviously, the big cycling nations are not in the Commonwealth Games. England and Australia are obviously big cycling nations, but you don't have the Europeans in the Commonwealth Games. And sort of from that point, I was never really, once I sort of got my first professional contract for European or American teams, it's not, you have to battle a little bit with team to get released from the contract to go do the Commonwealth Games, and it was just didn't really ever seem worth it for the hassle and the underwhelming experience that I had the first time. So I sort of felt through my sporting career that a little bit of that mindset around the Commonwealth Games, and I did question its value. Yeah, as an athlete. But I've just been to Birmingham and working in the athlete support space for the New Zealand Olympic Committee there. And it sort of reinvigorated me a little bit. And I know there's been a lot of talk over the years of the value of the Commonwealth Games, to that, you know, people saying that it's dead, doesn't really have it's not the Olympics, it's not global enough. But you know, when I saw the way the people of Birmingham embraced the Commonwealth Games, and what it meant to so many of those people there, and also because I was working for the New Zealand Olympic Committee across a range of sports, you know, everything from lawn bowls to rugby to judo, wrestling, you know, it's really, you know, and a lot of those lawn bowls particularly, our wrestling and judo athletes are good, but maybe they're not quite at that Olympic standard, but they can go to the Commonwealth Games and be really competitive. And you sort of see that the Commonwealth Games, for those sports or athletes that don't quite, you know, can't quite get to that Olympic level is really, really important. And, you know, if you can inspire some kids to be involved in sport back in your home country through your performances at the Commonwealth Games, if it livens up a city like it did to Birmingham, then you start from a social perspective. You know, I guess I'm a bit older. I've got a bit more broad view of things now, and different things are important to me. And you start to see, well, there is a place for the Commonwealth Games. You know, it definitely, you know, effort needs to be put into it to make sure that it still happens. And, you know, although we love our elite level performance sport, it's really important to have you know, role models in sport on a social level and community level, to engage people and try and encourage them into sport, because, you know, it's important. It's important socially. It's important health-wise that we keep people active and we keep things moving and people moving. And if the Commonwealth Games is a way to do that, then that's, you know, that in my view is enough reason to keep it going.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. What are your thoughts? You've were at the Olympics 4 times with New Zealand. What are your thoughts with regards to the Olympics? Well, again, then and now, does that differ? I suspect it does differ a little bit from how you originally thought of the Commonwealth Games. But what are your thoughts and experiences from the Olympics?
Yeah, I mean, the Olympics is obviously an amazing event. You know, when I did my first Olympics in Atlanta through to Beijing, I think with, you know, many aspects became really, really different. You know, everything from security to social media and the exposure and engagement people could have with the Olympics. You know, I mean, there's lots of different experiences that one can talk about in, you know, when they've been over multiple Olympic cycles, like I have. You know, I do know, you know, one story from Beijing. Now, I remember like sort of going out riding in Beijing, and there were certain roads we were allowed to ride on, and they were all sort of barriered off, these roads, with big sort of advertising signs that we're allowed to train on. But if you look behind those, you know, the poverty when you're out in the country in the outskirts of Beijing seemed really, really prevalent, but it was all hidden by these big screens on these roads we were training. So you sort of see stuff like that and you're going, man, this is, you know, you're not seeing the real Beijing through the eyes of the Olympic Games. And, you know, we all know that these events are big political beasts, as we see currently with the Football World Cup, right? Mm. So there's all that sort of stuff tied up in it. You know, from a cyclist perspective, you know, I think because our sport does have events that are so global every year, such as the Tour de France, and always the Tour de France was in July, and then a week or 10 days later we'd have the Olympic Games on an Olympics year cycle. But I think for road cycling particularly, why the Olympics is important, Tour de France and World Championships, which happen annually, you would probably, most Europeans would probably want to win a Tour de France over an Olympic medal, which is probably not the case in many sports. So our sport is a little bit different like that. There's lots of nuances given the characters of our sport, and comparing that to the Olympics compared to other sports. There's the political issues. But sometimes you just got to see through all that, see the Olympics for what it is. And it's the same, like now I'm with the Football World Cup, we all know the issues around FIFA. We know the issues around Qatar getting the Football World Cup and those sorts of things. But sometimes it's just good to watch really good sport, right? And if we get opportunities to do that, like we do at the FIFA World Cup or the Olympic Games, I'm all for that. And sometimes, you just want to push all that political stuff aside and enjoy some good sport as well. And the Olympics is definitely good for that.
Well, and ultimately, I suppose what it does is in like with Beijing and Qatar, they are masking what is going on in normal life in Beijing and Qatar. But actually, what ends up happening is it brings the conversation to we get the amazing sport. I mean, like I don't know if you were watching the football last night, where Germany went out, Spain nearly went out, Belgium went out. It was absolutely bonkers. But it is bringing that conversation to the rest of the world and bringing awareness, isn't it? So actually, in some ways, whilst the host country are trying to hide certain things, I think actually perhaps in the long run it proves to be as helpful for them in terms of perhaps changing that as it is for inciting sport. With your so you did the Tour de France 7 times, which and you finished all of them, which I think is unusual. But I think there are some particular stories that you've got from within the Tour de France that not being somebody that watches it all the time, though these stories kind of really stood out to me. I think one involved being shot. One involved headbutting. So tell us a little bit about the highlights of the Tour de France, but perhaps also throw in those stories as well.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the amazing things about the Tour de France is its purity and loyalty to the sport. I always used to feel this, coming off the back of the Tour de France and then going to the Olympics and having all those surrounding issues at the Olympics, with it, which were not always sport related, but the Tour de France is nearly always about the sport. The athletes at the Tour de France are the priority. Getting the race going and having the race going smoothly is the priority. Like, it's such a and the cyclists are the focus of the Tour de France. And when you got to the Olympics, like, you were just absorbed in this big media mass of all these different athletes, and it's just a really different feeling beast. You don't actually feel like you're part of a big sport. You obviously feel like you're a big part of a big sporting event, the Olympics, but it's so big that you just sort of get absorbed in it. Whereas the Tour de France is just about cycling. It's just about the sport. And what you come to realise with the Tour de France is what it means to the French, and it's such a big cultural event as well. And the towns are preparing for it all year. They're having festivals when the tour comes to town, and it just means so much and people on every level in a community in France connect in some way to the Tour de France. Its connection is just huge, and it creates a special energy around that. It's such a obviously there's been years where it's been quite quite predictable, but you're just never really sure. You know, something's going to be thrown up at some stage during the Tour de France, and you know, whether you're just a bunch full of kind of like I was much of the time, and it can be random things. Like the time that I did get shot, it was a lot of media hype around it, and a big deal was made out of it, but it was really kind of nothing, because it was all around the terrorism attacks around in Madrid. It happened earlier that year, and terrorism was well, it's still alive and a big threat now, but it was just sort of coming into the fore. But we were sort of out, I was out the back of the race, and we were in the Gruppetto, which is the sort of one of the last groups on the road on a sort of medium mountain stage with a bunch of sprinters. And when we get the bunch of sprinters, you know, we just have to arrive together at the finish for the next sprint stage. You still got to ride hard, because you've got to ride within the time cut, but you're all together and just trying to survive to get through that stage. But as we were sort of cresting one of the hills, there was myself and Oscar Freire, who was the world champion at the time. We were sort of riding along, and we hear this tink, 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 and it was sort of a cold day. And you know, when you're riding your bike on a cold day and a stone sort of hits up and flicks you in the finger or in the face or something like that, you sort of feel it, but it just kind of has that numb sort of feeling, because the skin, your fingers or your skin's kind of cold. And that's kind of what it felt like. And then Oscar comes back past me and he goes, "Oh, I've just been shot." And he had some blood coming out the side of his leg. So he's gone back to the medical car to see them, because each group always has a doctor following in the medical car. And they've sort of radioed ahead to say, "Oh, some of the athletes have been fired at during the stage." And we arrived to the finish like half an hour before, I think, Heinrich Hausler had won. And then there was just this massive media storm. And, you know, they were saying, "Oh, how does it feel to be shot in the Tour de France?" And I had taken I didn't know at the time, but I'd taken been shot in my finger. And then, mass media storm. You know, everyone's worried about security and all this sort of stuff. And I grew up on a farm here in New Zealand, and one of the things that we used to do was when cars were going past, and we'd have a BB gun and we'd shoot the cars going past and hope we didn't get caught, you know. So just kids on a farm, right, doing dumb kid shit.
I mean, growing up on a farm, I know what you're on about.
Yeah. So that's all I sort of thought about it, like, at the time. But media had blown it up. It had become a security risk. There was all these questions being asked. The police got involved, and I was up doing police interviews until like 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. But all the media around it was, "Oh, do you feel safe to start? How do you feel?" And all this stuff, which was just really nothing, because it was just a couple of naughty kids doing something they shouldn't have been, you know. But it turned out to be quite a big event, because of the current circumstances at the time. I got shot in the finger, and we still had a week to go. I got to Paris and racing up and down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, and my finger had still been quite sore, and it's sort of been all right. But I got home after the tour, and about 3 or 4 days later, my finger just got like massively infected. So I went to the doctor, and they x-rayed it, and the BB had actually lodged itself in my finger. And I've ridden the last week of the tour with that. So I actually had to have surgery on my finger when I got home to get the BB pellet taken out of my finger, which was kind of funny. I was going into the operating theatre and lying there in the operating theatre with my finger poking out and all the operating lights coming down, waiting for my finger to be operated. But yeah, it was all right, but kind of a funny story.
Excellent. And I can't help but ask, so I know you rode as part of Lance Armstrong's US Postal Service team. what is there one story that stands out to you about your interactions with Lance?
Yeah, I mean, we all know the controversy surrounding Lance, and no one can deny those. But he did a lot of good things for a lot of people. But I think in terms, if we think about sport, and this is one of the things that I always like to talk to aspiring athletes or young kids a bit about, is everyone's got something to give. There's something to teach you. There's something to learn from someone. Sometimes it might be what not to do, but there's always good things to learn. And one of the things that I really learned from Lance was, he was no matter like what people say, he was hardworking, and he demanded a lot of the people around him. And I don't know, some of your listeners may have seen that Michael Jordan documentary called The Last Dance on Netflix.
Yeah, it's really
and a really good documentary, and certainly really worth watching. But what Michael Jordan did to the Chicago Bulls was what Lance Armstrong did to those in his team or those around him. He brought them up through his work ethic and the way that he went about his business, to his level. And when you get people like that can bring a whole organization up, as Michael Jordan did to the Chicago Bulls, you can achieve some extraordinary results. And there's no denying that cycling, like triathlon, it's a hard man's sport. It's a hard working sport. You've got to put the hours in, and Lance was really the epitome of that. There's all that peripheral stuff as well, but I saw and experienced an athlete that worked night and day, thought everything through, attention to detail, and just worked like really immensely hard, and that was something that I tried to aspire to and carry through my sport career. And you hear about all the great athletes, the Michael Jordans, Lance Armstrongs, Tiger Woods, the Williams sisters. They worked, man. They trained. They worked and they trained. They worked and they trained. And you can't get away from that. If you want to be at that level, no matter what's going on in the periphery, that's at the core of it.
Yeah, I think it comes back to something we've talked about on the podcast a few times, and particularly in recent episodes. But I think it's all about that. It gets talked about a lot with the 10,000 hours, doesn't it? And we see people that seem to be naturally talented, but what we don't see is what goes on behind the scenes, and how those people, whether it's Lance, whether it's Richie McCaw, whether it's Michael Jordan, they just seem they put in the hours, and particularly the sort of the purposeful practice, as it gets termed, or deliberate practice, to really kind of become the absolute best. And I think that's really interesting. Now, you were known as the best lead out man on the tour for in your day. Now, I have to admit, I had to kind of I listened to your podcast to understand what the lead out man was, but I think I kind of understood it. But that meant that you were working your absolute socks off until towards the end, but never really getting the kudos. How did that sit with you, and how does that naturally come easy, or is it that sometimes you're thinking, do you know what, I could push on and potentially win this? How was it to be a lead out man?
Yeah, I think New Zealanders by nature tend to steer a little bit away from the limelight. Generally, not all of them, but generally. I think when you've come from a country like New Zealand, you're in the European racing scene. You're given an opportunity with a team. You feel really privileged to be able to be given that opportunity. Given that New Zealand cyclists, particularly back in the day when I was forging my path, weren't really well known. The things are a bit different now. But you had to be grateful, and I got my first ride in the Tour de France because I was taken because I was going to be a lead out rider for Thor Hushovd. And just to give people some context, you're basically, Thor Hushovd was the sprinter, so we're going for the mass sprints, the big sprints, and you're delivering that sprinter that's going to hopefully win the race to within 200 meters of the finish line. And I think it was a little bit me by nature. But although when I was younger, I did have a lot of victories. Then I spent 2 or 3 years in that lead out role, got really established, really well respected. But then you spend 2 or 3 years racing, not going for the win, and the chip kind of changes. And although I did try to get out of that when I left the French team at GreenEDGE and have an opportunity, the mental shift around that is quite enormous, and I didn't really probably realize it at the time, or surround myself with the support network that I needed to try and make that shift. And then I sort of spent a year trying to search out my own opportunities and do my own sprints and have a team for me. And we didn't get any success. Anyone that's been in professional sport, or anyone that knows anything about professional sport, will quickly realize, you're really only as good as yesterday's race, because there's plenty of talent coming up behind you. Sponsors want results, and if you don't, if you don't prove your worth, then, I'm sorry, but we'll find someone else, sort of thing. So, from being that lead out guy, I tried to make that shift out of there. Wasn't comfortable, didn't really do that well. So I sort of fell back into it almost by default. Having said that, I've really enjoyed that role as well, because, you're the guy. So, I was the last guy with the sprinter behind me. I'd have 2 or 3 guys to organise in front of me, and you're that actual one, like, sort of calling the shots in that final few kilometres of the sprint, when to go, when to hold back, when to move left, when to move right. And then you've got 4 or 5 guys that you have to really build that trust on, and it's quite an awesome when you get it going well, and that movement within that group and within the peloton is really fluid, and there's a lot of trust there, and people can know what's going to happen without really communicating it, because you've worked so well together. It's a really unique thing to be a part of, and I guess for me, you can stand on the podium, you can get the media attention, but what I always really used to value was when we turned up at the start line the next day, and the people that I was competing against would say to me, "God, that was a phenomenal lead out you did yesterday," or "Thor Hushovd wouldn't have won if it wasn't without you," or "Tyler Farrar wouldn't have won that stage if you hadn't have done that," And when the people that you are competing against, or the people that really know the sport, say that to you, to me, that was always the highest accolades that you could ever get,
Brilliant. I suppose I can't help being a Brit that cycles. I can't help but using the term marginal gains. Where do you think the marginal gains are going to come from in the next few years? Or if that's too difficult a question, where have they been recently? But where do you think that those kind of, because we're all looking for marginal gains, aren't we? And where do you think they're going to come from?
I think I think there's going to be a evolution in the mind, and I'm not sure really the best way to explain this, but there's going to be an evolution in sports psychology, I reckon, in sort of the next 3 to 5 years. And when I say sports psychology, what I'm meaning there is helping athletes create more broader identities of themselves. So I think we've gone through a phase where everything's been really sort of scientific down to the nth degree, collecting data on that, logging that, fixing that, making these small changes around all the stuff that we can measure scientifically. And there's a lot of that, and that stuff's still going on, and that will still go on. But I think there's a lot of unknowns around athlete mindset. And that's it, certainly, GB's done a lot of good work in this space, but I think they've only really scratched the surface of it. I reckon there's going to be some big shifts around, and this might sound a bit out there, around spirituality and individuals being a bit more free-spirited about their identity, creating identities for individuals where they can work in high-performance environments, but still connect back to where they came from, and allowing that connection to where they came from to be brought into that high-performance space, even though, a group of scientists at British Cycling or British Triathlon might not be able to quantify that. But if you can make that athlete feel a little bit comfortable and make those connections to where they've come from, and it sort of goes a little bit back to when I talked about one of the drivers for me about forging a pathway through professional cycling was the need to travel and the need to explore different cultures and experience different cultures. And it's sort of like that was sort of a cultural or a social need of mine. But cycling was kind of almost the vehicle to do that, right? To fulfill that. And I think that there's going to be a really interesting space, and I've already sort of started to explore some of this stuff here in New Zealand with Maori frameworks and Indigenous frameworks, and what makes those athletes thrive. So I think there's going to be some big openings and some real interesting, cool stuff. We're seeing athletes from all over the world, competing in sports at a high level that we've never, from cultures that we'd never really expect before. But you can't take people from Africa, drop them into a European professional cycling team and hope they're going to be all right, But if you create that, if you connect with where they're from, bring some of that stuff into the team, support them around that, I think there's some real interesting space there to be able to, change the concept around high performance.
And having read James Kerr's Legacy, which is all about the All Blacks, which I don't know whether you've read or not, but do you think this is one? I mean, obviously the All Blacks probably not had their best year ever this year, but for given the size of the country, the All Blacks have massively overachieved year on year. Do you think what you've just described is part of the essence behind why the All Blacks have overachieved for so long?
I have read James Kerr's book. Look, I have to say, I think it was, I think the timing of that book, I mean, with all books that that people perceive as being really good. There's always an element of timing in that as well, and I certainly don't think that the All Blacks did what they did because they made the athletes sweep the sheds out, right? I think it's definitely part of it, but what I sort of think is that I see this in my own kids at secondary school now, is the football coaches or the rugby coaches get the kids to sweep the shed out because that's what was written in James Kerr's book, right? That's how we create a good team. And I think it's just kind of bullshit, I think it worked for them at that particular time, yeah. And amongst a whole lot of other stuff that was going on, it's kind of a cool story. It worked for them. Definitely has value and adds some character value to the organisation. But you can't just, and this is what I was going back to a little bit before, you can't just blueprint these things like from organisation to organisation. I just think that stuff just doesn't work because it's not. There's no cultural connection down through that organisation. I think the All Blacks sort of developed that. That was their thing. Lots of other bits and pieces sort of added to that, and that worked really well through that time frame. It's a bit like Sky Cycling, right? They had a really good model that worked for that period that they were so dominant. And Marginal Gains was definitely part of that. They tapped into that. They did that really well. But that stuff doesn't last forever, and you can't just take that and then drop it straight into another team or another environment and hope that it's going to work.
Perhaps that whole marginal gains piece was actually part of the psychology as well as I'm sure the gains were absolutely important, whether it was the sleep or whether it was the aerodynamics or whatever it was. But for that period of time, perhaps that was the thing that the whole team was bought into, and perhaps that delivered some sort of psychological benefits that you've just described. But I think that's really interesting, and I love your take on sweeping the sheds. So that's very funny. So given that you understand the world of triathlon and you understand the world of cycling clearly even better, is there anything that you think that the world of triathlon could learn from what you guys are doing in cycling at the moment, and also vice versa? Is there anything that you think that you guys could take from what's going on in triathlon at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, kind of one of the things that I sort of that I think is good in triathlon is they're not afraid to experiment with the format of the sport a little bit, like those super short course triathlons, the teams triathlons, the mixed relay teams triathlons, all that sort of stuff. And I think cycling sort of played around with it a little bit, and I think you'll go through phases, and I think triathlon may have already done this. They'll try some things, doesn't really work, and then they'll just shelve it, right? I think that stuff's kind of cool. I think that creates, I remember, Jerry Ryan, who was the owner of GreenEDGE, and then now the Bike Exchange cycling team that Simon and Adam cut their teeth in, and he is a renowned businessman in Australia, and made his money through camper vans, but expanded out to other businesses to create more wealth. And one of the businesses he had was the Walking with Dinosaurs show, which some of your listeners may have seen. But it was a show that traveled the world, great for kids. And go see these life-size dinosaurs in a stadium that all sort of moved around or whatever. But it was an entertainment business, And Jerry always used to sort of say to us, he still owns a cycling team, that we're in the entertainment business in professional sport. That's what we do, right? We entertain people that want to watch us, and you really got to keep that. As much as people might not think that's the case. It is the case, because that's where our revenue comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening now is there's so many new sports that kids can do and get engaged in, and there's so many different ways of watching sport that you have to keep your finger on the pulse. You have to keep trying new stuff, and I think triathlon is pretty good at that, and I think cycling needs to try and enter that space a little bit more. You definitely got to try and cycling is much more historical and traditional. You've definitely got to retain some of that stuff. But how do you bring new elements into it is kind of definitely one of the things that I think about a little bit in comparing those two sports.
I think that's really interesting. And I think so you've just hit on a hot topic at the moment, in that so I think triathlon is good at innovation and trying different things. But equally, at the moment, we've just had the announcement that the Ironman World Championships won't happen every year in Kona. So they're going to switch it. They haven't quite announced all the details yet, although it would appear that most of the details are out, even though they've not been announced. So I think that I think they're taking away some of that magic and history. And, for a lot of athletes, it's not like the age groupers. It's not really about going to the World Champs. It's about racing in Kona, the home of triathlon. And I think moving it away from there takes some of that magic away. And so perhaps this is something that triathlon needs to learn from cycling, which is very much, other than that, other than the fact that they've just announced that the Tour de France is not going to finish in Paris next year, which perhaps it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Although I think that's just a one-off and probably for slightly better reasons. But is that something that triathlon needs to learn from cycling to keep that kind of history and culture there, and some of the magic and mystique within it, as opposed to purely being about innovating and making it bigger?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you 100% on that. If there was one event that's and I certainly don't know as much about triathlon as most of your listeners, but if anyone in the world thinks of triathlon, they think of Kona, right? That's the marquee event in the triathlon or Ironman world, and to me, it just seemed ludicrous. A ludicrous thing to do is to take some of the heart out of that, and I don't think you talk about them not finishing in Paris the year after next, but that's not going to be an issue, because the year after that they'll go back to Paris. That's definitely a given. And the Tour de France, I think hasn't always, there might have been another time it didn't finish in Paris as well, I reckon. But
it was in 1905 or something like that.
Yeah. So, but it's just going to be a one-off, right? The year after it finishes in Nice, it's going to go back to Paris, like, for sure. So, and I think, also one of the things, we're always, people are pushing for equality in sport, and triathlon's always been really good at that. And even you have the women's and the men's events together in Kona, they're on a par there, right? And I think that's to separate them out and have them in different locations is just sort of going away from what it seems like to me. It's going away from what the rest of the world is trying to create.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a real shame, and I think that I think when you take some of that magic away, it just becomes about, well, actually, if it's not magical, I might as well go and do the race that's kind of somewhere completely different, or the PTO race rather than an Ironman race, or kind of it all becomes somewhat neutral, doesn't it? I agree.
Yeah.
So we ask every guest that comes on the podcast for a book recommendation in terms of, is there any books that you've found? We've talked about a couple of resources in terms of The Last Dance, which is absolutely brilliant. The James Kerr book, which you're less keen on. But are there any books that you find yourself recommending, or that you've found to be really helpful in your journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I guess as you know, if we're going back, it's probably a little bit out there, a little bit off topic, but I've sort of been reading a lot lately around Eastern spirituality and yoga practices and meditation and the value of all that stuff. And the book that I've been reading, which is not in my office here with me at the moment, is called Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And it's a book really, you know, I think since I've retired, I've started to look into the stuff a little bit more after a few struggles and trying to, your professional cycling career's gone, athletic career's gone away from you. So who are you really, and all that sort of stuff. And this is why some of the stuff I was alluding to earlier about creating, giving athletes at the top level space to actually identify with who they are, I think can have massive performance gains at the top level as well as help them in life after their sport. So that's been an interesting space that I've sort of been delving in a little bit. And interestingly, I'll just tell you one little story about that book. It was at Steve Jobs's funeral when he died. Everyone that went to the funeral was given an iPad box, and they thought that in the iPad box was going to be a brand new iPad. But all the people that attended that funeral opened the iPad box, and there was a copy of that book in that box. And it was said to be the only book that he actually ever kept on his iPad, and he read it once a year. So there's it's definitely been a book that's inspired a lot of people. It's not probably topics that we are really used to discussing when we're talking on podcasts about high performance sport or sport, but I reckon just watch this space. All that stuff is going to be coming into sport at the highest level in the coming years.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I have had that book on my reading list for a little while and never got round to actually putting it to the top of the reading list. But I hadn't heard the Steve Jobs story about that, so I shall be getting into that book very soon, actually, because that's really interesting. Now, one thing that we've started doing on the podcast is getting the previous guest to ask the next guest a question without knowing who that guest will be. So previous guest was Leon Chevalier, the triathlete. Claire, have you got Leon's question?
I have. I'm still here. I haven't talked the whole time. I am still here in the background.
Well, the delay is kind of meaning that it was just a bit easier for me to take over, I think.
No, but super interesting to hear about, particularly around the kind of psychology of things. And I think that is a huge space that is semi untapped. So I think it'd be interesting to see. So when we spoke to Leon, so one of his questions, or his question, was and this is some of the things that we talked about actually in our interview with him. What have you done maybe behind the scenes that no one else has known about, that's made a huge difference to your career as a professional cyclist, if anything?
Yeah. I think for me, probably two things was, as global athletes, we're traveling around all the time, we're living in different places, and I think, especially being from New Zealand, where we're the bottom of the world, we're the most furthest away from anywhere in the world, but learning to when you're traveling around, or when you're going places, learning to settle in, embrace where you are, and get connected with the people that are around you, and often, especially, a lot of cyclists, a lot of triathletes now, if they're going to Europe, they'll go to Girona, and they'll stay in Girona, and they'll have their little cliques there, and they don't really go outside of that. But your experience will be much easier when you're an athlete. You'll get much more personal growth out of it, you'll feel much more connected. We're social creatures. We thrive on connection. We do well when we're connected, and if you just put a little bit of effort into making that happen, I reckon that can, and it can just be, even if you're a middle of the road triathlete wanting to go away and do some events somewhere else, just those little things can make the experience so much more enlightening.
Interesting.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the things I've loved about getting into triathlon is the opportunity to go and race in parts of the world that I would never have gone to ordinarily. Whether it's kind of Cervia in Italy, whether it's Tallinn in Estonia, or just different places that I wouldn't be going to. I mean, Tallinn I should have gone to on the stag do circuit, but I somehow missed it on that. So going back to do an Ironman seemed like the obvious next step. But I just think it's a brilliant excuse to travel, and I think particularly with what you've done, you must have. How did you find the culture difference between? Was it a cycling with lots of passionate French and Italian cyclists? Was that sometimes difficult, or was it just was it a bonus?
I mean, it was really difficult. When you're entrenched in a Danish team or a French team, as my some of my key experiences were. You have to. I mean, French do things their way. They're a cycling nation, and you're not going to change the way that they do things, and you just have to find ways to work around that, and try and adapt your practices and the way you do things, to best fit around that. But it can certainly be frustrating, and particularly those you mentioned about marginal gains, but if you looked at cycling 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because it was so steeped in tradition, gains were really easily made, because no one, we just thought that, that's how the Europeans did it, so that's how it must be best, but things are changing. The European teams are catching up, the French teams are catching up, but still they get stuck in tradition, and that can be sometimes frustrating and hard to deal with.
Brilliant. On that note, Julian, we'll wind up, but it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. And in particular, I've loved talking about the sort of history of the importance of the history in the sport, and also the psychology thing. I think you're absolutely right. I think there's, as you say, we've scratched the surface on that with things like Dr. Steve Peters, but there's a whole lot deeper stuff to go through. I thought the book you were going to say actually was the Resilience Project, which is by an Aussie, which is a really lovely book he's an Aussie teacher, but on mindfulness. Really, really good book. But I'm definitely going to check out the autobiography of a yogi. And but yeah, thank you so much. And I wish you great success as a sporting director going forward.
Great. All right. Now, thanks for the time, guys. Really enjoyed the chat.
If you want to find out more about Julian, the best place to find him is on Twitter, and he is Julian Dean NZ. So what do you make of the chat with Julian?
It was great. I think actually something for everyone in terms of some of the things that we covered. So you know, we were talking actually just before the podcast about the Kona, the World Ironman World Championships, and the moving from Kona and the splitting of male and females. And I think, you know, that tied in really nicely with what we were talking about in terms of history behind cycling, and that actually their history is so great behind the cycling world that actually even the Olympics aren't something that really draws them in. It's actually their bigger cycling tours. So and I think probably where we are right now as triathletes, and I know many listeners are triathletes, you know, I think that's our history, isn't it? That's where our history sits in terms of, certainly if you do endurance triathlon, is Ironman. So I think that was very kind of pertinent to where we are right now, really. But yeah,
I thought it like, I hadn't really expected to end up having that conversation with him, but it absolutely hit the nail on the head when, as you say, when the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games just didn't really seem that important to him, because it was all about, you know, the Grand Tours and the classics and all, because of the history and the culture associated with them. And then we've got, at the same time, we've got Ironman going, we're not going to, we want to basically get more athletes in, so therefore we're going to take it away from, I mean, like, imagine if they just said, right, well, you know, we're not going to do the Tour de France in France anymore. We're now going to do it in Qatar, because guess what? You know, the money means that we can make more money. I'm not saying Ironman are only doing it to make money, but I think
it's an interesting point.
But you know, it just rips the soul out of it. And there is only so much the innovation and making it, you know, again, it's like cricket is trying to innovate massively with things like 2020 and the 100 and all that sort of stuff. But you've got to have the core, you know, if that all ends up, again, if they go playing Qatar, it's going to rip the soul out of it, isn't it? So yeah, I think that was really interesting. What else did you take from Julian's conversation?
So I mean, and I think this leads on from a number of conversations we've had throughout the podcast, kind of more recently actually, is, you know, we talk about these marginal gains, don't we? And there's so many developments in kind of the world of, you know, data collection, new ways of measuring, you know, all of what can we tap into to make ourselves as good as we can be. And yet he comes back to, actually, it's our psychology, our head. And, you know, this is really interesting, isn't it? It's not something that you can buy. It's like going out and buying happiness. You can't do that. It's something that you create. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it, although in the world of professional sport, the use of like psychologists, for example, has been there for many years, but it's interesting, like, how can we improve ourselves through that psychological route? And he brought in kind of the spirituality bit as well, didn't he? And actually, I was just thinking of our kind of interview with Mark Allen and kind of what he was talking about there as well. So I think that to me is really interesting. Yeah, how about for you? Like, what are your thoughts? Because I know you're quite a data-driven person and you like your figures and numbers. And how does that sit with you in terms of from a psychology perspective?
I completely agree. I think, you know, why do you think we ask about which books have the greatest impact on people? Because actually, that is, you know, like, it's a book versus a power meter, and I know that a power meter has helped me, but books have helped me way more. And whether that, you know, obviously some of those books are more on, but none of the books I tend to read are on marginal gains. They're more around psychology. And you know, books like Alex Hutchinson's Endure just show that how much untapped potential in the human species is there when it really needs to be. You know, I don't know if you remember the chat we had with Charlie Spedding, and he was like, well, you know, my goal was to win a medal, and he'd got the bronze medal was in the bag. Could he have probably gone on and won a silver medal if that was if that had been his goal, or if that next person had been the gold as opposed to, you know, would he have gone a bit faster? Would he have gone a bit faster if a lion was chasing him? Absolutely, no doubt. So, you know, that central governor theory of, you know, pushing beyond what the brain seems to want to let you access is, and clearly some people are better at that than others. And understand, you know, you've only got to watch James Cracknell to see what some people can do to themselves. I just think it's, I completely agree, and I think that's the data stuff is interesting to a certain extent, but for me the psychology stuff is way more interesting, and there's so much scope for development there. I think there's a really, just on that point, there's the one story that I keep coming back to, and I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the podcast, but I've talked about it a lot while drinking over a pint of real ale. I think it's in Adaharahan Finn's book, The Rise of the Ultra Runners. He talks about a story where there was a very average runner, she was a runner but not brilliant, and then she was in a car crash. And I don't know if you've ever seen the film Memento, but the film Memento with Guy Pearce is where he can't make short-term memories, so he basically keeps you see the film in reverse because he can't make these short-term memories. And essentially the same thing happened to this lady that was an average runner, but what it meant was she couldn't remember being tired from the last few months. And as a result, she went from being a very average runner to a top ultra runner, just because the brain, physically she hadn't changed, but mentally she was forgetting that she was tired, and that allowed her to push far deeper into, override the central governor. So I just think that's really interesting. So I think there's so much potential there.
Yeah, I think just to bring it back into the world of nutrition as well, I think we spend a lot of time, which and you said that all of these things are really, really useful. It's useful, and it can improve our performance in terms of having a power meter, for example, or maybe whether it's looking at measuring core body temperature or whatever it might be, or lactate testing, which is now kind of exploded again in the world of sport, certainly in the world of triathlon. Some of these things some of the actually easiest things are some of the best things for us to optimize. So in terms of psychology, but also in terms of things like nutrition, people, so many athletes that come to me are people that haven't thought about one of the easiest things that they can change in terms of optimization of performance. So I think there's so many pieces, aren't there, to the puzzle, and we need to kind of start thinking about every single area in terms of marginal gains, rather than what's the next piece of equipment that I can buy that's going to help me get better. And I think there's a I was chatting to a friend of mine that's a Ironman triathlete, and also but focusing predominantly on running at the moment. And she was talking about how, when, I can't remember which race it was, I think it was when she did Ironman Barcelona, which was her first, she said prior to that she had just nutrition was just whatever seemed to be right at the time. And then she first got that was the first race she actually got a nutrition strategy given to her. And she said, I don't know whether physically it made that much difference. It probably, I'm sure it did, but mentally it had a massive impact, because suddenly I knew that the nutrition there was some sort of theory behind the nutrition, and that confidence. There's a thing that I think it's in Endure, where, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. When you take a gel, it takes 20 minutes for the gel to actually give you any energy physically, except if you swill it around your mouth, you basically tell your brain that sugar is en route to the stomach, and it actually is shown to give you an immediate uptick in performance, even though it takes actually 20 minutes for the energy to get there. That interests me. What are your is there any? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there is absolutely science behind the mouth swill effect of carbohydrate mouth rinsing. And it didn't ever really take off that much in the world of sport, but it is something actually I still talk to my athletes about. At the end of an Ironman race, if you can't stomach anything, you know, if you get a gel, swill it out and spit it out, you're going to get some stimulation from it. But, you know, we've got receptors in our mouth that start breaking down carbohydrates. So, and people forget that it doesn't just happen in the stomach. You're already breaking down with amylase in your mouth, you're breaking down carbohydrates. So it does sense that you have carbohydrate there. So it does make sense in that sense. And it's the neural pathway effect of it. A bit, well, it's not the same pathway as caffeine at all, but that similar effect of that caffeine is not giving you energy, it's giving you the perception of having energy. So, you know, same as the kind of the mouth swill effect is, you know, your body is already starting to recognize there's carbohydrate there and already releasing amylase to start breaking it down. So, you know, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think that, you know, the world of psychology is and how powerful our you know, our brains are is just amazing. And I think that's something that shouldn't be forgotten in a world that's dominated so much by, and especially in the world of sport, that's dominated so much now by kind of other metrics and measuring and
gadgets.
Yeah, so gadgets, absolutely. I was trying to think of the words, but yeah, gadgets.
Gadgets and things that we can spend money on, which ultimately is not the psychology stuff, is it?
No, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes people will spend money to fix a problem, you know, spend money to make themselves faster. And this is what I always get some of my athletes to think about. You know, what are you spending your money on to make yourself faster? Because it's interesting in essence.
But we all like a nice shiny thing to show for the fact that we've spent money on it, which is the battle that you have, isn't it? Because you know, we're willing to spend a lot of money on a new bike if we think it's going to make us go faster. But actually, it's like buying a really, really smart, you know, car for the drive and then putting the wrong petrol in it.
Absolutely. And you know, if you're kind of spending out on a new set of wheels, for example, and you know, you talked about something shiny. Well, actually, ultimately, if you're going out to race, you not want the shiny part being the part of standing on the podium with something shiny, you know, because ultimately that's why most of us are racing. And yet, if that new set of wheels doesn't get you to the finish line because your nutrition fails you or your head fails you, you know, that's it's an interesting. It's not an interesting concept. It's a concept, you know, that you know we do need to start thinking about if people really want to kind of, you know, look for those kind of little 1%, for sure. So yeah, he stimulated some good conversation for sure.
He did. And the other bit I loved was just the bit that he finished with, which was as a result of Leon's question, which I really like asking these questions from the previous guests. We often get some of the best content out of the question that was asked totally randomly to a stranger. But the connecting with where you're, you know, traveling and connecting with where you're based and kind of embracing that culture, I think is really powerful. It's really good for the soul. I'm a massive believer that traveling is good for the soul, and actually I suppose that's one of the reasons why I quite like traveling on my own some of the time, because it forces you to embed yourself more. When you've got the safety of others around you, you can kind of stay away from it, can't you? But no, you've got to dive straight in, feet first.
Absolutely.
If you're on your own. What do you experience? You didn't talk about that so much in the podcast, but you know, you obviously travel a lot more than me for Ironman stuff. Do you tend to find that you can get yourself embedded, or is it just you're just so focused on the race you just
I think it depends on how long you're there for, but you know, you picked up on this. It certainly makes you travel to places that you probably wouldn't have picked for a holiday destination. So I really love that aspect of it, and I do actually try and have some time afterwards that I can spend in that sort of area or go off into another part of that country and do something. I think for me, like, you know, in the world of food, I love, like, that's the first question I always ask people: what's the food gonna be like, and then planning like what food can you have, what foods, you know. So that for me is always really, really exciting, but that comes with culture, doesn't it, and the history behind, you know, a lot of what we eat. You know, I always give the example of every country has got their own bread. There's some sort of starchy carbohydrate that every country has. So that's always my like first thing, is like, what's their bread? What's their staple? What do they have? But I think, you know, absolutely, I think there's certain things you need to be a bit careful of before you're racing, because as you know, as much as going out there and doing all these things, we can tire ourselves out by going out and walking around, you know, the streets of a new city, for example, or indulging in some really nice local delicacies, which is great. but one of those things, I always save those kind of things for after I've raced. So I go and have a look around and look at all the wonderful things that I can eat, but then wait till afterwards to have those things.
But it's a good reason to make sure that you stay on for a few days afterwards, because you're right.
Yeah.
In the lead up to a race, you don't want to be on your feet all day. You don't want to be trying lots of local, depending on where you are. If you'd stay away from things like snake blood pre-race. That's not going to be a good time for playing around with stuff like that.
Although I wonder how much iron's in there,
Yeah, I'm sure. I only say that. I was just watching an Anthony Bourdain documentary on Netflix recently, and he was they had him drinking snake's blood, and I was like, oh yeah, he must have a fairly strong digestive system to be standing up to that. But it is why I personally would always try and hang on there for a few days afterwards, just to actually enjoy the place and kind of go off and explore a little bit, both culturally and from a culinary perspective as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, it was a really interesting chat, and good to link into that conversation about being rather disgruntled about what's going on with Ironman at the moment, because that to me is a real shame. But we will no doubt continue that conversation as we find out more, if we don't already know it. Right. So good luck with your training, Claire. We're just saying that it's only 12 weeks until we both do Ironman South Africa. That is frightening. So yeah, good luck with that. And for everybody else,
when you're not training at the moment, that's for sure.
Well, you can enjoy the Christmas turkey that much more.
Exactly.
And for everybody else, keep on training. And remember, this podcast was sponsored by 33 Fuel. So rethink your sports nutrition with 33 Fuel, award-winning natural sports nutrition for your performance, health, and a fitter future. It's the 33 Fuel Fuelosophy. Get yours at 33fuel.com, and if you use the discount code TRIBEathlon or the link in the show notes, you'll get a discount at the checkout. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do review it and share it, because it helps other people find what we think is really valuable learning lessons from amazing athletes. So please do that. You can also find the whole back catalogue at TRIBEathlon.com, and you can also find out about the TRIBEathlon app, which helps people find events, find people to train with, and enjoy their events through their tribe. So check out TRIBEathlon.com.